My name is Stepanek. I'm the chair for the Division of Preventive and Occupational and Aerospace Medicine here at Mayo Clinic in Scottsdale. I'm the co-director of the Aerospace Medicine Vestibular Research Laboratory. I would like to share with you some interesting findings that we discovered in our study looking at the cognitive performance using the King-Devick test and eye tracking in hypoxic environments. Now, the hypoxic situation as it pertains to flight is when you go to high altitude, and this can be merely going in an airplane, because an airplane, the cabin, while you don't perceive yourself going to altitude, the airplane flies at altitude and the cabin actually goes to elevations up to 8,000 feet. And people who are sensitive to it may start having, as a result of that, symptoms, and they can sense that there is a little bit less lack of oxygen in the atmosphere. Most definitely, if they have issues such as heart or lung disease, then they're going to be prone to noticing that much quicker. But these are symptoms that can be noticed by climbers at extreme altitudes. It can be noticed by people who fly at high altitudes without having the luxury of oxygen systems, for instance in unpressurized aircraft, or then in pressurized aircraft where it can happen that the pressurization system fails, and as a result of that, people start having problems with lack of oxygen. The work that we've done looks at what happens when people are looking at a certain visual tracking task, and we made them go through it in situations where they had two conditions: either purely lack of oxygen, about the equivalent altitude of about 23,000 feet, and the other condition was a little bit more hypoxic, but this time with adding a little bit of CO2 to the breathing gas, and that altitude was about equivalent to 25,000 feet of altitude in terms of level of hypoxia. We did this by providing the individuals gas mixtures that were mixed in a fashion where they would have decreased levels of oxygen, so we could simulate the hypoxia of altitude without actually having to go to altitude. Now, why did we do that? We did that because we were interested in finding ways how we could be just looking at the eyes and see if there's any features that we can look at eye tracking that would tell us whether this person is performing normally or has issues and decreases in performance due to lack of oxygen, such as, for instance, in an airplane when you're flying at high altitude and the oxygen pressurization system fails and people get gradually incapacitated, which still to this very day can be a reason for accidents and loss of life and loss of aircraft. Now, the study showed that there's indeed features of eye tracking that can be quite useful that show significant differences between normal oxygen conditions versus low oxygen conditions, such as blinks. So frequently people blink. So it's interesting, when you read a sheet of paper on a book, for instance, you will blink less. But if you're in a situation where you're fatigued, you're under a lot of stress, or, such as in our study, you have lack of oxygen, your body involuntarily is going to blink more. So that was a very characteristic feature that distinguished the two different conditions. Interestingly, by adding CO2, we were able to have people perform actually equally good on some of these markers and features that we were measuring, and we're about equivalent in performance almost to some of the ground level performance, for instance speed and errors. It allows us to start looking at a marker on the human body that is tied very much to the flying task of a pilot without having to encumber the pilot by putting stuff on them. So we can basically have them just do what they do, and we just measure what they do, and as a result of that, hopefully can find early warning signs. So if there were to be something that happens in an aircraft and the oxygen levels are starting to go down, we ideally would love to be able to give the pilot warning well before they start to become incapacitated, because then by definition you can lose aircraft and the crew, and that, if it's possible to give them early warning signs, could be prevented. This could be in a whole host of different transportation environments, quite important, and we're looking at some of these features in the context of sleep. We're looking at these features in the context of different medicines that could be in the system of people, and see if we can see the same markers as we have with lack of oxygen. The first study that we did proved that lack of oxygen and the test, the King-Devick test, which is a test that allows us to have people read numbers on 3 test cards and do it very quickly, is a good test to measure their ability and their performance in a hypoxic environment. That test has never been used for that before, and it has the distinct advantage that it's a test that is very brief. So you can do this testing within a minute, and if you start having differences and people take longer to do it, you can discern that much quicker, whereas some other tests take many minutes to do, and in hypoxic environments you may not have that duration of time of the luxury to even run a test that is 5 minutes long. So that makes it very convenient. The difference between the first study and this study is that here we actually measured eye tracking on top of just the performance of the test itself, and extracted features that would be markers that separate what is normal performance on eye tracking versus performance in lack of oxygen versus performance with CO2 added to the hypoxic gas mixture. And as mentioned, we added CO2 as part of the condition to correlate what type of performance changes can we see.